May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Britain celebrates the defeat of Nazi Germany. RAF Bomber Command's fleet of Avro Lancaster heavy bombers, the aircraft that carried the strategic bombing campaign to Germany, has completed its mission. The statistics are staggering: 7,377 Lancasters built during the war. 156,000 plus operational sorties flown. 608,612 tons of bombs dropped on enemy targets. 3,249 Lancasters lost in combat. 55,573 Bomber Command aircrew killed. The Lancaster squadrons bore the brunt of these losses. But victory brings a problem. What do you do with 4,000 plus surviving Lancasters? The RAF doesn't need this many heavy bombers in peacetime. The cost of maintaining them is enormous. Storage facilities are limited. New jet bombers are being developed. The Lancaster is already obsolete. The British government faces economic crisis. The war cost billions. Rationing continues. Every penny counts. Maintaining thousands of bombers that aren't needed is financially impossible. The decision is made: rapidly demobilize. Reduce the bomber fleet to a fraction of wartime strength. But what happens to the thousands of Lancasters declared surplus? The answer is complex, surprising, and sometimes tragic. Some were scrapped immediately, cut up for aluminum scrap worth more than the intact aircraft. Some flew on in new roles: reconnaissance, rescue, transport, testing. Some were sold to other nations. Canada, France, Argentina bought surplus Lancasters. Some were converted to civilian use, becoming airliners and cargo planes. And a handful, just a handful, survived to the present day as museum pieces and flying memorials. This is their story. The untold fate of Britain's Lancaster bombers after the war ended. Within months of VE Day, the scrapping began. It was brutal and efficient. The economics were simple. An intact Lancaster had little resale value. Who needed a used heavy bomber? But the materials, aluminum, steel, copper, rubber, were valuable and scarce in post-war Britain. A Lancaster contained approximately 2 tons of aluminum alloy. With metal shortages, this was worth more scrap than flying. The process: airfields across Britain became scrapyards. Lancasters were lined up by the dozens, sometimes hundreds. Salvage crews moved through them systematically, remove valuable components, engines, instruments, radios for spare parts or resale. Strip aluminum skin from airframe. Cut up structural members for scrap metal. Melt down aluminum for reuse in civilian industry. The speed was shocking. A Lancaster could be reduced to scrap in days. By late 1945, hundreds were being scrapped monthly. By 1946, thousands had been destroyed. Specific examples: Leaming Airfield, Yorkshire, 150-plus Lancasters scrapped 1945 to 1946. Syerston Airfield, Nottinghamshire, over 200 Lancasters cut up for scrap. Dozens of airfields had similar scenes, rows of Lancasters awaiting destruction. The human element: for aircrew who'd flown them, this was heartbreaking. These weren't just aircraft, they were the planes that brought them home from 30-plus operations over Germany. Veteran bomber crew visited scrapyards to see their Lancaster one last time before it was destroyed. Some removed small parts as mementos, plaques, instruments, pieces of fuselage. One veteran described it: "We watched them cut up the Lancaster I'd flown 32 ops in. Every mission, she brought us home. Now she was just scrap metal." I cried. I'm not ashamed to say it. By 1948, over 3,000 Lancasters had been scrapped. The greatest bomber fleet in RAF history was being systematically destroyed for its raw materials. It seemed wasteful then. Today, knowing how few survive, it's tragic. Not all Lancasters faced the scrapyard immediately. Some continued RAF service in new roles: photo reconnaissance, PR, Lancasters, stripped of armament, fitted with cameras. Used for mapping and survey work. Operated over Britain and former combat zones documenting bomb damage. Flew throughout late 1940s until replaced by purpose-built aircraft. Maritime reconnaissance, some Lancasters modified for coastal patrol and anti-submarine work. Less effective than purpose-built aircraft but available and cheap. Used by Coastal Command for several years post-war. Air-Sea Rescue, ASR, perhaps the most important post-war role. Modified to carry airborne lifeboats in Bomb Bay. When ships or aircraft went down at sea, ASR Lancasters would drop survival gear and lifeboats to survivors. This role saved lives through the early 1950s. Engine test beds, several Lancasters became flying laboratories for testing new jet engines. Rolls-Royce used Lancasters to test early jet engines, mounting them in place of propellers. Armstrong Siddeley, Bristol, and other manufacturers did the same. These test Lancasters flew well into the 1950s, helping develop engines for the jet age. Training aircraft, some served as bomber crew trainers until replaced by newer aircraft. Navigation and bomb aiming training continued with Lancasters through the late 1940s. The numbers, approximately 600 to 700 Lancasters, remained in RAF service post-war in various roles. Most were retired by 1950 to 1952 as purpose-built replacements became available. These were then scrapped, with few exceptions. The extended service, these Lancasters gained a reprieve from immediate scrapping. But eventually, most still ended up cut apart for scrap. The ones that survived longest were the test aircraft, some flew until the mid-1950s before finally being retired and destroyed. One of the strangest transformations, Lancasters became civilian airliners. The Avro Lancastrian conversion, with bomb bays removed and fuselage modified, Lancasters could carry passengers. The Lancastrian featured, streamlined nose, gun turrets removed. Passenger cabin in former bomb bay and rear fuselage. Capacity, 9 to 13 passengers, tiny by modern standards but acceptable for 1940s long-range travel. Range, approximately 4,000 miles, excellent for transoceanic routes. The operators, British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC, operated Lancastrians on long-distance routes. British South American Airways, BSA, used them for routes to South America. TransCanada Airlines operated them briefly. Silver City Airways and other small carriers used them for freight. The routes, London to Australia via Middle East and India, the Kangaroo route. London to South America across the Atlantic. Experimental transatlantic passenger service. Freight routes across Europe and to Africa. The experience, flying in a Lancastrian, was not luxurious, loud, the Merlin engines were deafening. Cold, pressurization was minimal or absent. Cramped, 9 to 13 seats in a converted bomber. Long, flights to Australia took days with multiple stops. But it was fast by 1940s standards and available when aircraft were scarce. The famous incidents, Stardust disappearance, 1947, BSAA Lancastrian crashed in the Andes. The wreckage wasn't found until 1998, 51 years later. The final radio message, Stendek, remains mysterious. Several other Lancastrians crashed, highlighting that converted bombers weren't ideal airliners. The end, by the early 1950s, purpose-built airliners replaced Lancastrians. Most were scrapped or converted to freighters. A few lingered into the mid-1950s on cargo routes. The Lancastrian proved that Lancasters could have a civilian life, but it wasn't a long one. Britain sold or gave surplus Lancasters to Allied nations. Their fates varied. Canadian Lancasters, Canada operated its own Lancaster production during the war, built by Victory Aircraft. Post-war, they retained many for maritime patrol and search and rescue. Canadian Lancasters served until 1964, longer than any other nation. Used for coastal patrol, ice reconnaissance, and SAR missions. The last operational Lancaster military sortie worldwide was by Canada in 1964. French Lancasters. France received surplus RAF Lancasters post-war. Used by Aéronaval, French naval aviation, for maritime patrol. Operated in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Some served until the late 1950s. Several were used in colonial operations in Indochina and North Africa. Argentine Lancasters. Argentina purchased 15 Lancasters in 1948. Used for maritime patrol and transport. Operated by Argentine Air Force until 1967, remarkably long service. Several survived in Argentina until quite late before being scrapped or abandoned. Egyptian Lancasters. Egypt received a small number post-war. Used for transport and training. Most were quickly retired and scrapped. Swedish Lancasters. One Lancaster was used for scientific research and engine testing. Served into the 1950s before retirement. The fate of foreign Lancasters. Most were eventually scrapped when retired. A few survive as museum pieces in their respective countries. One Canadian Lancaster survives today as a static display. The irony, Lancasters sold to other nations often survived longer than those kept by Britain. Canada's operational use until 1964 meant Canadian Lancasters flew militarily for 22 years after VE Day. Meanwhile, Britain had scrapped most of its fleet by 1950. Beyond passenger service, some Lancasters became cargo aircraft. The conversion was simpler than passenger variants. Remove all military equipment. Strip out anything unnecessary to save weight. Fit cargo doors and loading equipment. Reinforce floor for heavy cargo. The operators, small cargo airlines across Britain and Europe. Colonial operators flying to Africa and Asia. Charter operators for unusual or urgent cargo. The missions, carrying general freight across Europe. Flying spare parts and equipment to remote locations. Supporting colonial operations, particularly in Africa. Emergency relief flights, food, medicine, supplies to disaster areas. Experimental cargo. Some modified Lancasters tested carrying unusual loads, livestock, sheep, cattle, for restocking post-war farms. Machinery too large for standard transport. Even a few carried cars and trucks in modified bomb bays. The economics. Operating converted bombers was cheap, aircraft cost little, often free as war surplus. Maintenance expertise existed, ex-RAF ground crew. Parts were available from scrapped aircraft. But efficiency was poor, fuel consumption was high, for Merlin engines. Payload was limited compared to purpose-built freighters. Reliability decreased as aircraft aged. The end of the cargo Lancasters. By the mid-1950s, purpose-built freighters, like the Bristol freighter, replaced them. The last commercial Lancaster flights were probably in the late 1950s. Most cargo Lancasters were scrapped when retired. A few lingered as gate guards or monuments before eventually being scrapped. The working life. For a brief period, Lancasters that once bombed Germany were delivering mail, freight, and supplies across the post-war world. It was inglorious work for a legendary bomber, but it extended their useful life a few more years before the inevitable scrapping. Some Lancasters served science and aviation development, engine test platforms. Lancaster PA-474, now the BBMF Lancaster, tested jet engines in the 1950s. Various Lancasters tested, early Rolls-Royce jet engines. Turboprop configurations. Experimental propeller designs. These test Lancasters contributed to development of engines used in Vickers Viscount airliner. Bristol Britannia. Early jet fighters. Radar and electronics testing. Lincoln's, Lancaster's successor, and some Lancasters tested, early airborne radar systems. Navigation aids. Electronic countermeasures. These tests influenced post-war electronic warfare and navigation technology. Aerial refueling trials. Flight refueling limited use converted Lancasters for early aerial refueling experiments. Tests helped develop technology used in modern aerial tankers. The Lancaster's stable flight characteristics made it ideal for refueling trials. High-altitude research. Several Lancasters were used for atmospheric research, weather research flights. Cosmic ray detection. Upper atmosphere sampling. These scientific Lancasters contributed data used in meteorology and physics. The longevity. Test aircraft often flew longer than operational bombers. Some test Lancasters flew until the mid to late 1950s. This extended service meant they were maintained in airworthy condition. When finally retired, some were preserved rather than scrapped because they represented significant research platforms. The legacy. Lancaster test aircraft helped bridge the gap between wartime piston engine technology and the jet age. Without them, British aviation development would have been slower and more expensive. The handful that survived from test programs are among the most valuable historical aircraft because they represent post-war British aerospace development as well as wartime bomber operations. As Lancasters were retired, some became memorials. The early memorials, late 1940s to 1950s, some Lancasters were placed as gate guardians at RAF stations. Others became monuments in town squares or parks. These were meant to honor bomber command and commemorate the dead. The problem: nobody thought about long-term preservation in the late 1940s. Outdoor display without protection meant weather damage, rain, snow, sun-degrading aluminum and fabric. Corrosion. British weather is harsh on unprotected aircraft. Vandalism. Souvenir hunters and vandals damaged many displayed Lancasters. No maintenance budget, they were left to deteriorate. The fate of early gate guards: most deteriorated beyond repair within 10 to 20 years. By the 1960s, 70s, many were in terrible condition. Some were scrapped when they became eyesores. Others were moved indoors to museums but required extensive restoration. Specific examples: Lancaster placed in Town Square in 1948, beautiful and moving initially. By 1965, corroded, fabric rotted, pieces missing from vandalism. 1970, scrapped as unsafe and unsightly. Multiple RAF station gate guards, removed in 1960s, 70s when condition deteriorated. Most were scrapped, a few were saved for museums. The few that survived, Lancasters that were moved indoors relatively quickly survived. Those placed in museums in the 1950s, 60s are still intact. Aircraft that received some level of maintenance as gate guards lasted longer. The irony: well-intentioned memorials destroyed more Lancasters than preservation efforts saved. Outdoor display without maintenance was a death sentence. Today, every preserved Lancaster is indoors or receives meticulous maintenance. The lesson was learned, but at the cost of many aircraft that could have been saved. By the 1960s, people realized, almost no Lancasters survived intact. The scramble to preserve examples began. The awakening: aviation historians and enthusiasts recognized that the Lancaster, RAF's most important bomber, was nearly extinct. Of 7,377 built, perhaps 20 to 30 remained intact by 1960. Most of those were deteriorating gate guards or foreign aircraft. The crisis was clear: act now or lose the Lancaster entirely. The recovery efforts, museums, aviation groups, and individuals began searching for salvageable Lancasters. Domestic searches, scrapyards were checked, occasionally a Lancaster escaped cutting for years. Former RAF storage sites, a few forgotten aircraft in remote locations. Gate guards were assessed, which could be saved. Foreign searches: Canada, Argentina, France. Did any countries still have Lancasters? Several were found in remote locations, abandoned but intact. The recoveries: Lancaster KB-889, found in France, used by Aeronaval. Recovered and eventually restored. Now displayed at RAF Museum Hendon. Lancaster FM-213, found in New Zealand, used as an instructional airframe. Recovered and restored. Now at Royal Air Force Museum Cosford. Lancaster NX-611, recovered and restored to taxiing condition at East Kirkby. Multiple other Lancasters were saved from scrapyards or foreign abandonment. The restoration challenges: aircraft that sat outdoors for 15 to 20 years were heavily corroded. Missing parts had to be fabricated. Documentation was scarce, nobody kept detailed records of post-war modifications. Funding was limited, museums had small budgets. The success: by the 1970s, approximately 15 to 20 Lancasters had been secured for museums worldwide. This seems like a tiny number, but without these efforts, perhaps none would survive today. The loss: despite these efforts, several Lancaster gate guards were scrapped before they could be saved. In the 1960s, 70s, perhaps 5 to 10 restorable Lancasters were lost to scrapping or deterioration. Each loss was preventable. Of 7,377 built, only 2 Lancasters still fly today: Lancaster PA-474, Royal Air Force Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, BBMF built 1945, too late for combat operations. Post-war service, photo reconnaissance, engine testing, various roles. Retired from active service but saved from scrapping. 1973, adopted by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Restored to airworthy condition and painted in authentic bomber markings. Flies at airshows across Britain, representing Bomber Command. Based at RAF Koningsby, maintained to military airworthiness standards. Arguably the most famous Lancaster in the world. Lancaster FM-213 Vera, Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, built in Canada by Victory Aircraft, 1945. Post-war service with Royal Canadian Air Force until 1964. Retired and placed in storage. 1964 to 1988, various preservation efforts and locations. 1988, acquired by Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. Restoration to flying condition completed in phases. Now based in Hamilton, Ontario, flies regularly at airshows. Often flies formation with PA-474 at special events. The significance: these 2 aircraft represent the entire flying Lancaster population. If either is damaged beyond repair, half the airworthy Lancasters will be gone. They're not just aircraft, they're flying memorials to 55,573 dead aircrew. The maintenance: both aircraft require intensive, expensive maintenance. BBMF has full-time RAF engineers. CWHN has dedicated volunteer and professional staff. Parts are increasingly difficult to source, many must be custom fabricated. Flight time is limited to preserve airframes. Each flight hour requires 50+ hours of maintenance. Both organizations constantly fundraise to keep their Lancaster flying. The experience: when these Lancasters fly, the sound is unmistakable, for Merlin engines in perfect harmony. Veterans who flew Lancasters in combat come to see them fly, some cry hearing the engines. The sight of a Lancaster overhead connects modern audiences to history in ways photos and museums cannot. The future: both Lancasters are aging. Eventually, they may become too fragile to fly safely. Plans exist to preserve them as static displays when flying is no longer possible. But for now, they fly, the last 2 of 7,377. Approximately 17 Lancasters survive in museums globally, in addition to the 2 flying examples: United Kingdom, RAF Museum Hendon, London, Lancaster R5868S Sugar, 156 squadron aircraft with 137 operations, most surviving operational sorties of any Lancaster. Restored and displayed indoors. RAF Museum Cosford, Lancaster FM-213, Canadian-built, recovered from New Zealand. Imperial War Museum Duxford, Lancaster NX-611, Just Jane, maintained in taxiing condition, runs engines regularly. Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre, East Kirkby, NX-611 can taxi but doesn't fly. Canada, Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, Hamilton, the flying FM-213 Vera mentioned earlier, but also maintains static Lancaster KB-976. Canadian Museum of Flight, Langley, British Columbia, Lancaster FM 104. National Air Force Museum of Canada, Trenton, Ontario, Lancaster KB 882. Bomber Command Museum, Nanton, Alberta, Lancaster FM 159. United States, National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, Dayton, Ohio, Lancaster KB 889. Australia, Australian War Memorial, Canberra, Lancaster W4783, G for George, one of the most complete and original surviving Lancasters. RAF Museum, Point Cook, Lancaster KB 889. New Zealand, Air Force Museum of New Zealand, Lancaster NX 665. France, Musée de l'Air de l'Espace, Paris, Lancaster KB 889, formerly with Air Naval. The condition varies, some are pristine, fully restored, displayed in climate-controlled museums. Some are complete but unrestored, original condition showing age and use. A few are composite aircraft, assembled from parts of multiple Lancasters. The significance, each represents one of the 7,377 built. Each has a unique history, operations flown, crews carried, targets bombed. Together, they're the physical link to Bomber Command's history. Without them, the Lancaster would be known only through photos and film. Hundreds of Lancaster crash sites exist, some with significant wreckage remaining. The crash site distribution, over 3,000 Lancasters were lost in combat or accidents. Many crashed in Germany, occupied Europe, or the North Sea. Some crashed on training flights over Britain. Bodies of water, lakes, seas, preserve wreckage better than land sites. The major sites, German crash sites, hundreds of Lancaster crash sites across Germany. Most were bulldozed or salvaged post-war. Some remain in forests or remote areas. Occasionally discovered during construction projects. North Sea wrecks, hundreds of Lancasters lie on the seabed. Some have been located by marine surveys. A few have been partly salvaged. Most remain undisturbed, they're war graves. British crash sites, training accidents and returning damaged bombers crashed across Britain. Many sites marked by small memorials. Some have been excavated by historians and recovery groups. The recovery ethics, crash sites where crew died are treated as war graves. Recovery requires permissions and respect. Personal items are returned to families when possible. Aircraft parts may be recovered for museums. The remarkable finds, 2015, Lancaster wreckage recovered from IJsselmeer, Netherlands, remarkably preserved in cold water. 2013, Lancaster discovered in English Channel, mostly intact on seabed. Various recovery projects have found engines, turrets, and other large components. The controversy, should crash sites be disturbed? Relatives of crew often oppose recovery, their graves. Museums want artifacts for display and education. Aviation archaeologists want to document history. The consensus, where crew remains are present, sites should be left undisturbed. Pure wreckage sites without human remains can be carefully excavated. All recovery should respect the dead and prioritize education. The hidden Lancasters, somewhere on the seabed or buried in European soil, are hundreds of Lancasters. Most will never be recovered. They're permanent memorials to the men who died in them. Several ongoing projects aim to restore non-airworthy Lancasters. The Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centres, Just Jane, NX 611 current status, taxiable, engines run, can move under own power. Long-term goal, return to flight. Challenges, extensive structural work required, estimated cost £3 to £4 million. Part sourcing, many components must be custom-made. Fundraising ongoing, restoration progressing slowly. Significance, if successful, would be the third airworthy Lancaster globally. The Canadian Lancaster restorations, multiple Canadian museums have Lancasters in various restoration states. Some aim for static display quality. One long-term goal is creating another airworthy Lancaster. Challenges similar to UK projects, cost, parts, expertise. The composite projects, some restorations use parts from multiple Lancasters, fuselage from one, wings from another, tail from a third. Creates ethical questions: is it a real Lancaster or a replica? Most historians accept composites, survival matters more than purity. The challenges all projects face: cost, full restoration costs millions. Parts, original parts are rare, reproductions are expensive. Expertise, few people remain who know Lancasters intimately. Time, restorations take years, sometimes decades. Funding, relies on donations, grants, volunteer labor. The success stories: several Lancasters have been restored from derelict gate guards to museum-quality displays. The techniques developed for Lancaster restoration inform other historic aircraft projects. Volunteer communities have formed around these projects, keeping skills alive. The future: several Lancasters are in better condition today than 20 years ago. Restoration work continues to improve surviving aircraft. The knowledge base for Lancaster restoration is being documented before the generation that knew them passes away. The dream: aviation enthusiasts hope one day to have 3 to 4 airworthy Lancasters. This would require enormous resources but isn't impossible. Every restored Lancaster honors the 55,573 who died in them. Argentina's Lancaster story is unique. They operated them longest outside Canada. The acquisition, 1948, Argentina purchased 15 surplus RAF Lancasters. Used by Fuerza Aérea Argentina, Argentine Air Force. Assigned to maritime reconnaissance and transport duties. The service: Argentine Lancasters flew until 1967, 22 years after VE Day. Used for coastal patrol over South Atlantic. Antarctic support missions, landing on ice with ski gear. VIP transport for government officials. Training for bomber crews. The surprising longevity: why did Argentina keep them so long? Limited budget for replacement aircraft. Lancasters were paid for and serviceable. Spare parts available from other retired aircraft. The capabilities still met Argentina's needs. The retirement: by the late 1960s, age and parts scarcity forced retirement. Most were scrapped locally. A few were preserved. One became a monument in Buenos Aires. Another was preserved at an air base. At least one was abandoned at a remote airfield. The preservation challenges: Argentine climate is harsh, heat and humidity corrode aircraft. Limited preservation expertise and funding. Several preserved Argentine Lancasters deteriorated badly. Some were scrapped after years as monuments. The survivors: at least one Argentine Lancaster survives today in restorable condition. There's been discussion of recovering it for museum display. It represents the last chapter of Lancaster operational service. The final military missions were Argentine. The significance: Argentine Lancasters prove the design's versatility and longevity. They operated in roles and climates never envisioned by Avro designers. They flew 7 years longer than any RAF Lancaster. The last Lancaster to fly a military mission did so in Argentine colors in 1967, a fitting end to an operational career that began in 1942. The mathematics of destruction are sobering. Total production: 7,377 Lancasters built 1941 to 1946. Combat losses: 3,249 Lancasters lost in combat. Post-war survivors: approximately 100 plus intact at VE Day. The rapid reduction: by end of 1945, 500 remaining, 600 scrapped in 7 months. By end of 1946, 500 remaining, 2,000 scrapped. By end of 1947, 500 remaining, another 1,000 gone. By end of 1950, 100 remaining, 400 scrapped. By end of 1960, 30 remaining, most others scrapped. Today, 17 static survivors plus 2 airworthy equals 19 total intact Lancasters. The scrapping rate: peak destruction, 1946 to 1948, when hundreds were scrapped monthly. Approximately 6,800 Lancasters were destroyed, combat losses plus scrapping. Only 0.26% of all Lancasters built survive intact today. This is a 99.74% attrition rate, almost total extinction. The comparison: Spitfires, 240 plus survive of 20,000 plus built, 1.2% survival rate. B-17 Flying Fortress, 40 plus of 12,000 plus built, 0.3% survival rate. Lancaster survival rate is worse than most other major World War II aircraft. The WWII, immediate post-war scrapping destroyed thousands. No preservation culture existed in the 1940s, 50s. Aluminum was valuable, intact aircraft were not. Foreign sales and continued use in other nations helped, but most were still eventually scrapped. The what-ifs: if Britain had stored even 100 Lancasters in 1945, perhaps 20 to 30 would survive today. We'd have more examples of different variants. More could be restored to flying condition. But post-war economic crisis made this impossible. The harsh reality: for every Lancaster in a museum today, 387 were destroyed. The two flying Lancasters represent 7,377 aircraft. The survivors are precious beyond measure, they're all that remains of the greatest bomber fleet Britain ever built. Not all Lancasters were standard bombers. Some unusual variants met interesting fates. The Manchester connection: the Lancaster evolved from the failed Avro Manchester twin-engine bomber. Some Manchesters were converted to Lancaster configuration. Most Manchester/early Lancasters were scrapped immediately post-war. None survive today. The Type 464 provisioning, dambuster Lancasters modified to carry Barnes-Wallace's bouncing bomb for the Dams raid. Post-war, none were preserved in this configuration. The modifications were removed and aircraft returned to standard use. Today, the BBMF Lancaster occasionally carries a replica bouncing bomb for displays. The Lancaster X, Canadian production built by Victory Aircraft in Canada. Slightly different from UK production. Several Canadian-built Lancasters survive in museums. The Lancaster ASR Mk3, maritime version for air-sea rescue. Carried lifeboat in Bomb Bay. Most were scrapped when retired in early 1950s. None survive in ASR configuration. The Lancaster PR.1, photo reconnaissance version, unarmed. Used for mapping and survey post-war. All scrapped when retired. The Lincoln, Lancaster's successor, closely related but distinct aircraft. Longer fuselage, different engines, improved performance. Many Lancasters were scrapped to make way for Lincolns. Some Lincolns survive in museums but most were also scrapped. The experimental Lancasters, jet engine test beds, various jet engines mounted. Turboprop test aircraft. Electronic warfare test beds. Most ended as scrap after test programs concluded. The fate: almost all variant Lancasters were scrapped. The few survivors are standard bomber versions. We have no complete dambuster Lancaster, no ASR Lancaster, no PR Lancaster. Lost diversity means we can't see the full range of Lancaster capabilities. The lesson: preserve not just examples, but representative examples of variants. This lesson was learned too late for the Lancaster. While most physical Lancasters were destroyed, the cultural memory persisted. Film and media, The Dam Busters, 1955, immortalized the Lancaster's most famous mission. Used real Lancasters during filming, some later scrapped. Bomber Command, 1968 BBC documentary, featured surviving Lancasters. Numerous documentaries and films reference Lancasters. Books and memoirs, thousands of Bomber Command memoirs published. Many specifically about Lancaster operations. Books like Enemy Coast Ahead by Guy Gibson kept Lancaster memory alive. These cultural products maintained public interest in preservation. The RAF Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, established 1957, included Lancaster PA-474 by 1973. BBMF's public displays kept the Lancaster in public consciousness. Millions have seen PA-474 fly at airshows and flypasts. The sound of Merlins became synonymous with World War II remembrance. Memorials and monuments. International Bomber Command Center, Lincoln, Major Memorial Open 2018. Numerous smaller memorials reference Lancaster specifically. RAF Bomber Command Memorial, Green Park, London, features Lancaster silhouette. The Veterans, Bomber Command Veterans Associations kept memory alive. Personal testimonies recorded before veterans passed away. Many expressed grief that so few Lancasters survived. The popular culture, Airfix model kits kept Lancaster in public awareness for generations. Video games featuring World War II bombers always include the Lancaster. The aircraft became a symbol of British resilience and sacrifice. The impact, cultural memory preserved what physical preservation couldn't. Public affection for the Lancaster eventually drove restoration efforts. Without films, books, and memorials, even fewer Lancasters might survive. The cultural legacy ensured that as veterans aged, public interest remained, creating the environment where funding for preservation and restoration became possible. Reserving and operating Lancasters is extraordinarily expensive. Static display costs, indoor museum display, climate-controlled initial restoration, £500,000 to £2 million depending on condition. Annual maintenance, preventing deterioration £10,000 to £50,000. Specialist conservation work, ongoing. Outdoor display, gate guard initial setup, £50,000 to £200,000. Annual maintenance, £20,000 to £100,000, weather damage prevention. Expect significant deterioration despite maintenance. Taxiing Lancasters, maintaining in taxiable condition, £200,000 to £500,000 initial restoration to taxi standard. Annual maintenance, £100,000 plus, engines must be run regularly, systems maintained. Parts replacement, ongoing and expensive. Airworthy Lancasters, BBMF Lancaster PA-474, annual operating budget, £500,000 plus, estimate, included in BBMF total budget. Each flight hour, £15,000 to £20,000 estimated cost. Maintenance hours, 50-100 plus per flight hour. Major overhauls, £1 million plus every several years. CWHN Lancaster, Vera, similar costs to BBMF. Heavy reliance on volunteers reduces labor costs. Donations and fundraising essential, operates on approximately $1 to $2 million Canadian dollars annually for all aircraft. The parts problem, many parts are no longer manufactured. Custom fabrication costs, a replacement engine cowling, £30,000 plus. Instrument panel rebuild, £50,000 plus. Wing spar replacement, £200,000 plus. Some parts are irreplaceable. If they fail, the aircraft might never fly again. The funding sources, museums, government grants, entrance fees, donations. BBMF, RAF budget, taxpayer funded. CWHN, donations, fundraising, event fees. Private sponsors and corporate donations. The sustainability question, can these costs be sustained long-term? What happens when current volunteers and experts age out? Will future generations fund Lancaster preservation? The harsh reality, each surviving Lancaster requires constant financial commitment. Without ongoing funding, even museum aircraft deteriorate. The two flying Lancasters exist on financial knife edges. One major accident or funding crisis could ground them permanently. The future of surviving Lancasters is uncertain but not hopeless. The aging airframes, PA-474, BBMF built 1945, now 79 years old. Airframe hours accumulating with each flight. Eventually, stress and fatigue will ground it permanently. Estimated remaining flying life, unknown, but perhaps 10 to 20 years with careful management. When grounded, will become static display. FM 213 Vera, CWHN similar age and concerns. Canadian climate is harsh on aluminum. Remaining flying life similarly uncertain. The possibility of a third airworthy Lancaster, Just Jane, restoration continues. If completed, would provide insurance against loss of one flying Lancaster. Funding is the main obstacle, £3-4 million needed. Other Lancasters could theoretically be restored to flight, but costs are prohibitive. The static survivors, climate-controlled museum Lancasters will survive indefinitely with proper care. Outdoor displays face ongoing deterioration battles. Composite restorations from wreckage will likely add to museum population. The knowledge preservation, declining veteran population means direct knowledge is disappearing. Organizations are documenting maintenance and operational procedures. Training new generations of Lancaster maintainers and pilots. Digital archiving of Lancaster information for future reference. The threats, funding cuts could close museums or end flying operations. Accidents could destroy airworthy Lancasters. Parts scarcity could ground aircraft when critical components fail. Public interest could decline as World War II moves further into history. The hopes, improved restoration techniques might enable more airworthy Lancasters. 3D printing and modern manufacturing might solve parts scarcity. Growing historical aviation interest suggests sustained public support. Memorial functions ensure Lancasters remain culturally significant. The prediction, in 50 years, 2070 for the two currently airworthy Lancasters will likely be grounded. 15 to 20 museum Lancasters will still exist. Perhaps 1 to 2 additional Lancasters might be restored from wrecks. The Lancaster will be as remote from its operational era as World War I aircraft are today. But unlike World War I aircraft, significant preservation efforts ensure Lancasters won't be forgotten. From 7,377 built to 19 remaining, this is what really happened to Britain's Lancasters after World War II, the immediate aftermath, 1945 to 1953, 000 scrapped for aluminum and materials. Economic necessity drove mass destruction. Little thought given to preservation. Few people imagined future generations would care. The continued attrition, 1950 to 1971, 000 more scrapped as they were retired from various roles. Foreign Lancasters operated longer but most were eventually destroyed. Gate guards deteriorated from weather and vandalism. No systematic preservation policy existed. The Awakening, 1970 to 1990 recognition of Lancaster's historical importance. Scramble to save remaining examples. Restorations from derelict condition began. Flying Lancasters established as memorial aircraft. The modern era, 1990 present static population stabilized around 17 aircraft. 2 airworthy Lancasters maintained and flown regularly. Ongoing restorations and improvements. Increased public awareness and support. The mathematics of survival, 7,377 built. 99.74% destroyed. 0.26% survive intact. 0.027% still fly. The human connection, 125,000 plus aircrew flew in Lancasters during the war. 55,573 were killed, 44.4% casualty rate. The 19 surviving Lancasters represent their sacrifice. Every flight of PA-474 or Vera honors the dead. The final irony, Lancasters bombed Germany to rubble, then were themselves destroyed for scrap metal to rebuild Britain. The aircraft that survived bombing missions fell to economics and neglect. More Lancasters exist today than seemed possible in 1960, preservation efforts succeeded. But compared to what was built, almost nothing remains. The enduring legacy, those 19 Lancasters are precious beyond measure. They're not just aircraft, they're monuments, memorials, and time machines. When you see a Lancaster in a museum or hear one fly overhead, remember, this is one of 7,377. For every Lancaster you see, 387 were destroyed. This aircraft represents 55,573 dead aircrew and the largest bomber fleet Britain ever built. The Lancaster's story after World War II is one of mass destruction, neglect, late preservation efforts, and the dedication of people who refused to let them all disappear. What really happened? Almost all of them were scrapped. The tiny handful that remain are miracles of survival, and we must ensure they endure for future generations who'll never know anyone who flew in them, but who must never forget what they represented.